Welcome, everybody. In today's episode of the Sacred Wisdom podcast, we will be discussing the mental asylums or the insane asylums and Tartaria. So around the Orphan Train movement in the 1800s in the USA and other parts of the world, there were a lot of mental asylums that were set up. And it was used as a way to almost like recondition people, it would seem. So I am here with the amazing Stephen Denman again today. So welcome, Stephen. Thanks for coming along.
That's all right, Zach. I hope you're well.
Great. So let's just talk a little bit about these mental asylums. And they kind of started just around the 1700s, I believe the first one was just outside of London. There was a lot that popped up in the USA. And obviously we had the Orphan Train movement and all this migration that was going on. So let's talk about that and just see, tell us about the mental asylums and what was going on there.
I think before we go into looking directly at the mental asylums or the insane asylums in the United States of America, and also we can briefly touch on those in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and perhaps in some countries in mainland Europe, we have to put it in the context of the level of trauma and mental health issues, psychiatric illnesses or sicknesses that had arisen in the minds of literally millions of immigrants or migrants that had gone into the Eastern United States. So if we go back, say, to the period after the mud floods and the destruction of Great Tartaria, we have vast populations that were traveling from Great Tartaria and northern Russia into parts of Eastern Europe, then the Caucasus region as well, then on into countries like Spain and Portugal and Italy in Western Europe, and then taking freight liners and passenger ships across the Atlantic Ocean, were being crammed into the portside facilities and transported out. Cities were becoming massively overcrowded in the Eastern United States, obviously, especially New York City, but also in places like Chicago and places like Boston, for example. So they had to start moving populations, and obviously hence along came this plan called the Orphan Train movement to redistribute many of the orphan children, many of which did come from Great Tartarian Russia. Yes, there was obviously a lot of Western European children from France and Germany and other countries in Western Europe came as migrants into the United States of America. So, but at the same time, what the elites and the secret societies had to ensure with this Great Reset was they had to make sure that the adults that had survived, that had traveled from Great Tartaria, would not hold on to those cultural norms, remember the occult technology that was in place there, the aspirations towards Christ consciousness. So they had to also create separation and division in these families of Tartarians. So the children had to be separated. If they were already orphans, it wasn't an issue because, as we discussed previously, those children through the Orphan Train movement were placed into orphanages and were literally sold off or given away to farmers in the Midwest United States and so forth. And then obviously a lot of them were transferred from there into the many factories during the process of the Industrial Revolution and the mass mobilization and economic revival and expansion of the United States of America. But so the trauma of the events that took place, and this has got ancestrally, would have affected families and grandparents and great-grandparents from Great Tartaria and northern Russia, say from the first mud flood, the events of the second mud flood, and then the third mud flood, and in conjunction with the world fairs that were taking place at the same time, around that general period of time. So we can see there was so much trauma that hadn't been healed, so much stress and so much unhappiness, so much distress, so much of a loss of sense of rejection, abandonment, disorientation, and cultural disintegration from those original imprints that were really integral to the identities and the characteristics of these Tartarian Aryans. So the adults were then placed deliberately, because they simply didn't fit into American society, were placed into these repurposed buildings that had come from Great Tartaria, that were then turned into mental asylums or insane asylums. But at the same time, there was a huge building program that took place across the United States of America to create the Kirkbride psychiatric hospitals that were designed architecturally with specific types of space requirements, specific types of internal restraints and locks and different kinds of restrictive mechanisms on doors and staircases and elevators.
So
it really isn't.
Just to interject there, Steve, with the architecture. So just a little bit on that. There, you say about the repurposing of the buildings. This seems very specific because all the mental asylums, insane asylums, they're absolutely beautiful, the buildings.
Yeah.
And I know just in London, I know of a few, and they've been all turned into luxury flats now. They're absolutely amazing buildings. So
yeah,
what was going on there? Because they could have just chose, if they were a mental asylum, they could have just built a simple brick building, but these have a specific design, don't they? All these mental asylums. So it was like almost like an inversion going on them buildings and what they were actually originally used for.
Well, we have to remember, Tartarian architecture was designed specifically, the fenestration around windows and doors, the stone statues, the ornamentation. It was specifically designed to maximize and optimize the frequencies and vibrations coming off originally, the telluric electricity being drawn down from the atmosphere. We know that pretty much all the buildings from ancient Tartaria were all built on geomagnetic ley lines and the convergence of such ley lines, again, to optimize the ground-based telluric energy as well as the atmospheric-based electric currents. So what we see is that was inverted by the elites and the secret society. So it was done in a way as a mockery, a way to snub the original majestic greatness and grandeur and beauty of the architecture of the buildings that had been constructed originally in Great Tartaria and obviously in the different colonies, such as in the United States of America and Canada. And then obviously the duplication to some extent through, say, the Kirkbride psychiatric hospitals, where some of the architecture was in different ways sort of pseudo Tartarian, wasn't exactly the same, but it was a blend of that and, shall we say, Second Empire Victorian style architecture. So we can see it was a blending, it was a repurposing, it was a morphing process, and it was taking all of these adults from Great Tartaria especially and Northern Russia out of American society, so it would ensure they could not in any way pass on the customs and the traditions and any awareness of the occult technology of a Great Tartaria. And at the same time, most of those adults did have severe mental health issues. They just could not cope with the type of society that was being built in the United States of America, or the societies that were being built, across mainland Europe and obviously within the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So it was a very tumultuous time. It was a time of great emotional and psychological upheaval, as well as geographic and economic and occult technology-based upheaval that was going on across pretty much the Northern Hemisphere, really. It really did encompass the whole of the landmass of what is Russia today, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the North American continent especially. And we see this, to some extent, yes, we can include Australia and New Zealand. So these adults, were being placed into these mental asylums or insane asylums, and any excuse was given to remove their civil liberties, their freedoms. And one of the examples is reading novels was used as an excuse to place some of these adults into these mental asylums or insane asylums in the United States of America. And another excuse that was given was they weren't fitting into the social etiquette or the social normalities of the day. Well, that's because they didn't fit in, because culturally they were not from the United States of America. And as we've discussed so many times, the morals and the ethics and the spiritual development of the Nordic Tartarians or the Tartarian Aryans was radically different. What they put an emphasis on, in terms of their own development as an individual within communities and societies, was very, very different than what much of the Western world was based on and is still based on today. Even today, it's probably even worse now than it was over 100 years ago.
Between the 18th to 20th century, you had women, when they weren't able to conform or they weren't socially accepted, brothers and the male side of the family could actually send them to authorities. So they could be taken away to authorities, women, and put into these mental institutions because
Yeah.
they weren't seen fit for society. So they weren't fitting the social norms. It was basically like, so it wasn't just anybody. It was normal. It's a specific type of people. And men as always seem to be favored as they do in history. But interestingly as well, you had the Lunacy Act in 1845.
Yeah.
And this allowed authorities to basically give people treatment for their mental health or reconditioning or whatever, however you want to see it.
Yeah.
Very interesting time. And obviously 1845, 6 years only before the Great Exhibition and the industrial kind of age, which was the 1851. Obviously you had loads more world fairs, but 1851 was the benchmark.
When you look at the lunacy laws that were coming in the United States of America, and these were facilitated slightly differently in different states. So, for example, it was done differently in California to, say, Arizona or to Utah or Nevada, for example. And so we got to remember the conjunction of that date, the Orphan Train movement coming in from the 15th of January, 1864 to the 20th of December, 1889. That event itself would have created a huge amount of psychological trauma for the adults that had come from Great Tartaria and obviously Northern Russia. We can say also parts of Eastern Europe.
You had Ellie Island, Steve, which was the kind of camp that seemed to be that everybody went to, which not a lot of people know too much about. There's versions of it that went on, but I'd imagine it was quite horrific what was going on there.
Yeah. So, I mean, you take a look at the 3 mud floods and the trauma behind that, just as you look at the destruction and the genocide that occurred for the indigenous American Indians, with decade upon decade of mass immigration coming in from Western Europe and the complete destruction of much of Native American culture and the creation of the American Indian reservations and really so much a loss of their indigenous languages. And, we know from many psychic studies what happened. The soul personalities of millions of Native Americans went into the astral plane, and many of them became actual astral guides. And, even till this day, you still have a huge amount of trauma and sadness and sense of abandonment and loss amongst the various communities and societies of American Indians, in the United States of America. So that there's a parallel there with what was going on with the Tartarians coming out of Northern Russia and migrating into the Eastern United States. And I think the other aspect also is the fact that there was this collaborative relationship between what were known as the white giants or Tartarian giants. There's a lot more woodcuts, diagrams, and paintings of female Tartarian giants as opposed to male Tartarian giants.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We never see that. And
no.
That's one thing I've noticed about the whole giant movement. There are no female giants depicted in any photographs. When do you ever see a female giant in a film?
And yet the only place that I've seen any of that is with, as I said, mainly hundreds of different woodcuts and diagrams and paintings that have come from Great Tartaria and Northern Russia. But you always see them with human size or, Tartarians, male and female. And I think that destruction of that relationship, the loss of that relationship, which I think was very harmonious, it was a collaborative process between both groups to sustain and develop the civilization of Great Tartaria and Northern Russia. It had connections to do with the anti-gravity based occult technology as well as the somatic based occult technology that was being used in Great Tartaria. And I think that these white giants or Tartarian giants were integral to that kind of scientific development. And again, that's all being lost in history. And I think psychologically the knowledge and the awareness of that had to be quelled. And the elites and the secret societies knew there was a lot of adults coming in from Great Tartaria, Northern Russia, Eastern Europe into the Eastern United States. There was no way that knowledge could be disseminated amongst the American population, just as with the connections between the Native American tribes or the indigenous American Indians and the Lemurian continent and the civilization of Atlantis, which were always told by Western science nothing but fantasies and fictional history. but there is a racial and ethnic and linguistic connection on many levels for hundreds of Native American tribes. And that's in the United States of America and with the First Nations, Indians in Canada. So we know that a lot of this knowledge is all being lost. And with that loss and that removal of those original cultural identities comes tremendous psychological damage, tremendous mental upheaval. And then those individuals have to be contained. And this is what happened with the mental asylums or insane asylums in the United States of America, because it was a deprogramming process that was going on. And when you look at the numbers that were going into these places, there was very high levels of individuals going, and it became a huge industry in its own right.
And this was before the time that there were drugs available in the public domain, and people could. So this was people reacting to societal issues and things happening around them. So that is very important to pay attention to that, because this is what happens. You can see in today's age what we're having a higher level of mental health and people finding it hard to tackle society's problems. So Steve, just on average, how many asylums do you think there were in USA? Have you got any idea how many? I mean, there was a lot, and there's some very strange buildings in the middle of nowhere that seem to have been built, obviously, all around the 1850s. Every building seems to have been built around there, Victorian building anyway. But how many mental asylums do you think there were around USA?
Okay, well, let's have a bit of a timeline here and just get, again, a bit of a background as to what was going on. From the 31st of December, 1895, we know that in the United States of America, there was around 150,000 patients already being placed into these mental asylums or insane asylums. Now, just by the 31st of December 1904, that had arisen to at least 250,000. Some actual research shows it could be as high as 270,000. So I've read information on blogs and forums that state that around that time, that is by the 31st of December 1904, there was around 750 to 760 of these mental asylums or insane asylums. Now, what percentage of those were already buildings that had come from Great Tartaria, and i.e. therefore had been constructed with Tartarian architecture? They were either palaces, stately homes, mansions, governmental buildings, and they were repurposed as mental asylums or insane asylums, as opposed to those that were part of a huge hospital building program. Those statistics have never been made available. I think it would be almost impossible to get those specific numerics.
The architect was called John Smith. You know, it was always some name you'll never find. Some anonymous guy that's never made a building before in his life suddenly made his ornate building. That's all the case with it. In most cases, except a few. There are a few that were architects in England. Anyway.
I mean, you take a look, for example, on the 14th of April, 1811, you had what was called the McLean Asylum, was founded and opened. It was opened in Charlestown district of Boston in Suffolk County in eastern Massachusetts. Now, that was a very early constructed mental asylum or insane asylum in the United States of America. So obviously the McLean Asylum, when it was built and opened in 1811, was many years before the Lunacy Act actually came in the United States of America. You have to remember that there was many different organizations that got involved initially in the construction of these mental asylums or insane asylums. There was a building called the Asylum for the Relief of Persons Deprived of the Use of Their Reason, and it was renamed the Frankfurt Asylum for the Insane. And that was actually a Friends Hospital located in Philadelphia in southeastern Pennsylvania. And the Friends Hospital was actually built by the Protestant Christians known as the Quakers and opened on the 22nd of February, 1813. Wow. So you can see even the Protestant Christian churches themselves, they were already getting involved alongside the US federal government. And then you had the Kirkbride psychiatric hospitals, and they were built in numerous locations across the United States of America. And so this was a mass industrialized process like the World Fairs. It was about reprogramming, reformatting. It was about taking people out of American society that didn't fit the social norms. And when you're looking at some of the reasons that were given, and one of which is the reading of novels. Now, why would reading novels such as science fiction or fantasy adventure or crime thrillers or romance novels be an issue? And the reason is because it's about encouraging creativity and the imagination, and that creates an inquiring mind that isn't going to fit in to the mass conformity that they were looking for in American society with this industrialization.
Steve, this was going on. I mean, I looked at I think it was Hanley in Middlesex. I'll put a picture up on the screen. That was done around the 1700s, and that is an absolutely massive complex. So this was going on after the 1666, the fire of London, and other huge events that happened around the world. So it was almost like it was prepared. It was getting well prepared way before, and people and it was almost fueling that. And whatever was driving that almost knew the outcome. I find it strange that it was just after the 1666, because looking at the fire of London, realize there's a lot of suspicious things around that make you question quite a lot.
Well, that event in itself, the psychological and mental health of Londoners was horrific. It devastated a vast central London area, and it was really about clearance and the rebuilding. Much of the architectural designs in the buildings of that area in central London, where the outbreak of the fire occurred and then spread, were actually from Great Tartaria. And I've seen some incredible black and white photographs going back to the Victorian age, and you just look at the epic Tartarian architecture and the buildings, the fenestration, the ornamentation of the stonework, the roof lines, the mansard roof elevations. I mean, again, this vast building program that really started to accelerate in the United States of America, with the building of the mental asylums or insane asylums, is it really exemplified in these two examples, and one of which is the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum, and that was founded in Morningside Heights on the west side of Upper Manhattan in New York City, and opened on the 9th of September 1816. And then you had the very ornate looking Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum, also called the Western State Hospital. This was a Kirkbride psychiatric hospital, as I mentioned earlier, in the city of Weston in Lewis County, northern West Virginia. That was opened on the 18th of January, 1864.
And are all these buildings still here now? Are they still there?
A lot of them still are. And if you look at the actual outside of these former mental asylums or insane asylums, some of which are still have been repurposed and are used as hospitals till this day, you can clearly see connotations to and minor aspects that make you think, that looks very similar to Tartarian architecture. So there was a duplication process with some of these buildings as they were constructed.
If anybody's not sure about what Tartarian architecture is, please see the other videos on the channel. I'll give you some more detail. Stephen's got one great one where he's talking about the church, so check that out in Faversham, about Faversham. Sorry, Steve. So
we can see it was a long-term process. I mean, you can go back even to the beginning of the 14th century, even as far back as literally, say, January 1403, 1404, 1405. And this is when you start to see the initial attacks against Great Tartaria from, shall we say, outside forces. Now, we're not going to go into detail here, as to whether there were artificial or induced factors that brought about the eventual destruction of Great Tartaria in northern Russia. But in terms of imprinted trauma over generations, it could be argued that many of these Nordic Tartarians or Tartarian Aryans, as well as many people who were from the Sami or the Laplanders and the various Turkic tribes of Russia, perhaps there was quite an in-depth collective unconscious trauma they had carried, even though that civilization carried on for many centuries. It appears to be, coming right up to the third mud flood, there was so many attacks on different levels. It was literally whittling away the various colonies from Great Tartaria. That's the first destruction really occurred.
You had the early eugenics movement kicking in the early 20th century. And Japan, as late as I don't believe this is going on now, but as late as the 1950s, there were laws in Japan where they could forcibly sterilize patients. They had no human right whatsoever, so they could come into your place wherever you are and sterilize you and do whatever, however they wish they saw fit.
Well, you can argue were the same destructive and malevolent impulses behind, the National Socialist Germans as with the Imperial Japanese, and obviously after World War II ended on the 8th of May 1945, many of those eugenic practices, say in the Imperial State of Japan, were actually continued many years through the 1950s into the 1960s. So if it was going on there, as we see with many things that have happened with the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP, with what happened with the Tibetan Buddhists and the destruction of hundreds of Buddhist monasteries and the genocide of millions of Tibetans, both Bonpo shamanists as well as Buddhists, going on for decades. So we know that in terms of regime changes, this is something that has gone on in different countries around planet Earth, and therefore we can't say that the United States of America can be excluded from that because it's perceived as having the US Constitution, the US Bill of Rights, and all these other aspects that apparently make it a fair and decent democratic society. We know that there was this deliberate silencing of anything to do with the cultural aspects of Great Tartaria and northern Russia, anything to do with the somatic-based occult technology or aspirations towards Christ consciousness. We know that the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican City State did not particularly look favorably even on the Russian Orthodox Christian Church, let alone the practices of Christ consciousness development that were going on in Great Tartaria. And if you think about in terms of psychological and mental health, what better way to keep that restored than the use of healing with light and sound and prayer and meditation and a sense of unity and infinite oneness and infinite nowness that was being shared amongst the congregations and the laities in these various healing temples across Great Tartaria. And we know that Great Tartaria also was multicultural. Yes, the Tartarians themselves, from what we've seen from all the woodcuts, from the diagrams and the paintings, were Aryan people described, with the racial characteristics of the red hair and the blue eyes and blonde hair and the pale white complexions. They were pretty much Caucasians, but they had a very close working relationship with the various Turkic tribes, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Kyrgyz, and many others, as well as the Sami or the Laplanders. So there was a great sense of community spirit, of collaboration, and everybody supported and helped each other, which is kind of very different than we see today with much of what's happening in the Western world, where there's a lot of people that just kind of get along and tolerate each other because of the economic structure of the societies and communities they live in, but don't particularly care or like even their neighbors or much of the community they're in. So when it comes to what went on, we have to understand that there were so many layers to the trauma that created all this psychiatric disorders and mental illnesses that in itself became an industrialization process within the United States of America. So these mental asylums or insane asylums became places that were deemed as reprogramming centers. That's what they were really used for, so that there had to be mass conformity. And look what happened with the American Indians. Many of them did not want to go to work. They didn't want employment. They didn't want to earn money. They didn't want to pay taxes. They just wanted to live their lives as what the Native Americans really were, which was they were the first ecologists on the North American continent. And we've discussed before on many occasions how the white giants, who really were the Tartarian giants, had built these shining metallic cities that glinted in the midday sun up in the Appalachian Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, the Cascade region, where Washington State is today in the United States of America. So we know that the past was very different. And we know that that had to be suppressed, deleted, censored, and eradicated. So a formalized version of history had to then be wheeled out.
But there was a point, 100% a point, where whoever and whatever did this and made this happen, there was a point where they would have realized people would become aware to it. So I believe that whatever instigated this and made this, new people would find this out and people would be very angry. And I don't think that's an attitude to have. I think really is just understanding the past and understanding this history so we can kind of move forward in a productive way in the future. And that's what I'm coming on to now, Steve, is how now we know this and this information and we are kind of starting a new world, I believe, at the moment. So how can we positively use this information? What would you say to people with advice in the sense of helping them understand so they have a deeper understanding of the world from this information? What would you say to people?
I'd say that the most fundamental aspect of this is how we deal with trauma.
Yeah.
So what has to happen is not, and this didn't really happen, is you don't lock people away because they come from cultures that were part of the old world order, i.e. Great Tartaria and Northern Russia. You don't, allow the suppression of that occult technology, especially the somatic-based occult technology. What you have to promote when it comes to trauma and therefore mental health issues is the use of sound-based healing techniques, show compassion, use receptive listening, be patient, be kind, be helpful, be constructive, be supportive. And I think more than anything is to try and create communities and societies where there's a constant sense of inclusion for all individuals. So how alcoholism and drug abuse are dealt with, how all kinds of sexual abuse are dealt with, etc., is dealt with in a more proactive, hands-on, supportive manner, without judgment, without ridicule. I mean, to some extent, that is happening now with mental health outreach workers and support workers across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Western Europe.
Yeah.
It's now happening across actually the Russian Federation, and it's even happening in some parts of the People's Republic of China, even though there is a lot of human rights issues around state healthcare support in that country still, unfortunately. But the whole lesson really to be learned about what happened with Great Tartaria was it was a very traumatic transition where that civilization collapsed rather slowly. We have to also remember what we can also learn is even from past life regression and the work of clinical hypnotherapists who've had hundreds of case studies, even with the work of Dolores Cannon and the work of many other individuals. They have clients who have visions of their incarnations in the civilization of Atlantis. And
check out Dolores Cannon, people. Very interesting lady. Very interesting.
Yeah, and they see the sudden eventual destruction of Atlantis and the loss of millions of lives and how much trauma they're carrying. Now, that the destruction of the Atlantean islands, which were the remnants, occurred around 10754 BC to 10753 BC, so well over 10,000 years ago.
Right.
So the fact that it proves that a soul personality reincarnates in different biological forms, some of which you can class as Homo sapiens or human beings here on planet Earth, could be on any one of billions and billions of planets or moons just in the Milky Way galaxy, or in the Sagittarius dwarf spheroidal galaxy, or in any part of this physical universe, or in a parallel dimension or parallel reality or parallel universe.
Yeah.
So the soul personality, this moves on. It's part of the infinite oneness and infinite nowness. Consciousness surpasses the biological death process. So the same thing has actually occurred on planet Earth now. Many people who've reincarnated here, their soul personalities would have been in biological forms of those human beings that were Tartarians who had lived in that incredible occult technology-based civilization of Great Tartaria, the golden empire of Northern Russia, part of the old world order, where the idea of money was rather abstract and unusual to them. The idea of not being ever in a vocational form of employment that wasn't on a soul level vibrationally compatible with your exact needs, wants, and expectations would have been frowned upon. So there wasn't any kind of major mental health issues. So it's interesting, with the emergence of the New World Order, what we have is this arising of ever increasing mental health issues, which today, here in the 21st century, are now very, very serious. As you know, is that there's literally, it's almost an epidemic of severe mental health and psychiatric problems across the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Western Europe, certainly across the North American continent. And
I think in Britain, but especially Britain, we're very arrogant to these kind of beliefs. We believe the media do a fantastic job of painting this beautiful world around you in England, a very safe world. But there is a real lot of mental health. And I'd see it in London on a daily basis, increasing. Where I live is on quite a main road, and I hear people getting more and more drunk, more and more disorderly on a Friday and Saturday night, and it's deeply concerning. I would highly recommend that everyone who drinks to stop drinking. Drink is probably the worst intoxicating substance to put in the body, and it will destroy you. It will make you age quicker. It will give you disease. It might give you pleasure for a few hours when you need to get out of your head, but in the long term, it's very bad. We really need to keep aware at this time. It's very important with our health, mental health, all the different levels of health in our bodies. And we have to be aware of these social programs that are coming on us. But Steve, is there anything else? Sorry for interrupting you there, but I just had a point. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I think we've talked a lot about the asylums. I think people can go and do their own research on this. There's enough to look at. And please, everybody go and have a look, find out more information. But please, Steve, if there's anything else to add, please let me know.
Yeah, I'd say that in terms of alcoholism, one of the studies that's never going to be verified is with the millions of immigrants that were coming in from Great Tartaria, Northern Russia, Eastern Europe, and many from Western Europe. Yeah, there was a lot of, as I've said before, French and Germans and many other immigrants from that part of the world. Is the rising of alcoholism? How serious was that problem during those times after the third mud flood, during the Orphan Train movement? Was there various narcotic addictions to various substances, maybe opioids and so forth, that were going on? It's important to remember that whiskey was given by the colonial, Europeans to many of the Native American Indian tribes. So that their trauma, therefore, was dampened by the use of whiskey. And then you take a look, for example, how these various types of alcoholic beverages are called spirits. The constant consumption of alcohol shifts the frequency and vibration and therefore the aura around the human body, which allows for the attachment of... That's right. So negative entities in the infernal regions of the lower astral can therefore attach, and this also will augment and increase mental health issues and psychiatric disorders. And so there's a blurring there between demonic oppression, possibly even for some demonic possession, and severe mental health and psychiatric disorders. So I'd say rounding up the entire development of the mental asylums or insane asylums within the United States of America really was a result.
Europe. There's a lot in Europe.
Of course, there was a lot in Europe, but we're looking, I suppose I focus more on the United States of America because of the mass immigration that was coming in. So it was being used as a huge mind control experiment, really, of preparing the United States of America and therefore the US economy and the future of that landmass for a huge transitional process with mass industrialization as part of the Industrial Revolution, and to create literally mass psychological conformity, which is what suited the needs of the elites and the secret societies, and then eventually the corporations. And that's pretty much all I've got to say on the subject. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, look, thank you, Stephen, again. And look, if anybody would like to purchase our book, Mysterious Realities, it's now available as an ebook on Amazon or in paperback, or you can purchase direct from my site. It's brilliant, Steve. Thank you so much for your knowledge as always. And look, we'll see you all next week. And it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.